My name is Rachel Alvarez. I'm 34 years old, and last Tuesday night, I sat at table 7 in the grand ballroom of the Mayflower Hotel in Washington, D.C., surrounded by 300 of the most powerful people in defense contracting. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light over pristine white linens. Champagne glasses clinked in a symphony of success. Laughter echoed off marble columns polished to mirror perfection, and my father, Victor Alvarez, stood at the head table like an emperor surveying his kingdom. The evening was meant to honor his 40 years building Alvarez Defense Technologies into one of the nation's largest military contractors. Senators leaned back in their chairs, bellies full of prime rib and bourbon. Generals traded war stories between courses. Defense executives checked their phones for stock prices that never seemed to fall. This was their world, their glittering temple of power and influence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Mom sat to Dad's right, her silver hair swept into an elegant chignon, diamonds glinting at her throat. Margaret Alvarez had perfected the art of being the perfect contractor's wife, gracious, charming, never asking uncomfortable questions about where the money came from. She smiled and nodded at every toast, her practiced laugh tinkling like wind chimes whenever someone praised Victor's vision or leadership. My brother Daniel held court at table 3, his dress uniform crisp with ribbons that caught the light. West Point, 2 tours in Afghanistan, now a sought-after consultant who charged Fortune 500 companies $1,000 an hour to explain how wars worked. At 36, he was everything Dad had dreamed of, the golden son who understood that power came from uniforms and boardrooms and handshake deals worth billions. And me? I was the daughter they seated at table 7, not quite close enough to matter, not quite far enough away to disappear entirely. The cyber defense analyst who worked 14-hour days in windowless government buildings, whose security clearance meant I couldn't talk about my job at dinner parties. The quiet one who ordered salad while the men carved steaks, who sipped water while they drank whiskey, who listened to their war stories without mentioning that my algorithms had prevented 3 major cyber attacks in the past year alone. For 34 years, I'd been the Alvarez they couldn't quite categorize. Not glamorous like Mom, not commanding like Dad, not decorated like Daniel. Just Rachel, who did something with computers for the government. They introduced me to their colleagues with the kind of polite smile reserved for embarrassing relatives you couldn't quite disown. I watched Dad work the room before dinner, his silver hair gleaming as he moved from table to table. Firm handshakes, knowing winks, the kind of easy confidence that came from never doubting your place in the world. He'd built his empire one contract at a time, turning a small Virginia construction company into a defense juggernaut that employed 12,000 people across 6 states. Weapons systems, armored vehicles, military bases. If the Pentagon needed it built, Alvarez Defense Technologies had probably bid on the contract. The waiters cleared the dessert plates with military precision. Senator Elaine Brooks, chair of the Armed Services Committee, rose first. Her voice carried across the ballroom without a microphone, commanding attention the way only true power could. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her gray hair catching the chandelier light, "we gather tonight to honor a man who has served his country not on foreign battlefields, but in the factories and design centers that keep our warriors safe." Applause rippled through the crowd. Victor Alvarez represents the backbone of American defense, the private sector patriots who turn innovation into armor, ideas into artillery. More applause. Dad stood and nodded graciously, his tuxedo immaculate, his smile practiced. This was his moment, His validation. 40 years of building and climbing and conquering, distilled into a single evening of recognition. I shifted in my seat, the silk of my black dress rustling against the chair. Around me, conversations hummed with the comfortable arrogance of people who'd never doubted their importance. To my left, a Lockheed Martin executive explained to his wife why defense stocks were recession-proof. To my right, a retired admiral's widow discussed her charity work with homeless veterans, her tone suggesting she considered it a personal favor to the nation. None of them knew my name. None of them would remember seeing me there. In their world of billion-dollar contracts and congressional testimonies, I was furniture, background noise, the contractor's daughter who'd never quite found her place in the family business. But as Dad prepared to take the podium, as the room settled into expectant silence, something cold and certain crystallized in my chest. Tonight felt different. Tonight felt like an ending disguised as a celebration. I smoothed my napkin across my lap and waited for whatever came next, not knowing that in 5 minutes, everything I thought I knew about my place in this glittering world would shatter like dropped crystal. The applause died, Dad stepped to the microphone, and my story truly began. Dad's voice filled the ballroom like warm honey, smooth and practiced from decades of boardroom presentations and congressional hearings. He thanked the senator, praised the Pentagon officials scattered throughout the crowd, and launched into the familiar narrative of his rise from small-town contractor to defense industry titan. "When I started this company," he said, his hands gripping the podium with the confidence of a man who had never been told no, "I had a simple philosophy. Excellence isn't negotiable. Whether we're building a barracks in Kentucky or an aircraft carrier in Virginia, Alvarez Defense Technologies delivers what America needs when America needs it." The crowd murmured approval. Someone at table 2 called out, "Hear, hear," and scattered laughter followed. I'd heard this speech before, or versions of it. Dad's origin story, polished and perfected, about turning a $50,000 loan into a defense empire worth $2 billion. But tonight isn't just about business, Dad continued, his voice softening with what sounded like genuine emotion. It's about family, about legacy, about what we pass on to the next generation. His gaze swept across the room and landed on Daniel. My brother straightened in his chair, his uniform catching the chandelier light. "My son Daniel represents everything I hoped to build. Integrity, service, excellence. West Point graduate, combat veteran, and now a leader in his own right. He understands that freedom isn't free, and that those of us blessed with success have an obligation to serve." Applause exploded across the ballroom. Daniel rose slightly from his chair, nodding with practiced humility. Dad beamed with the kind of pride that filled rooms, that made other fathers wish their sons had chosen different paths. "Daniel will take this company into the future," Dad announced, his voice strong again. "He understands what it means to lead, to sacrifice, to put country before personal comfort." More applause. I clapped politely, my hands making soft sounds that disappeared in the thunder of approval. This was how these evenings always went. Daniel the hero, Mom the gracious wife, Dad the visionary builder, the perfect defense contractor family, worthy of magazine covers and campaign donations. Dad's eyes moved past Daniel's table, scanning the room with the casual confidence of a man acknowledging his domain. For a moment, I thought he might simply conclude with thanks and sit down, let the evening end with champagne toasts and cigar smoke and satisfied congratulations. Instead, his days found me. The pause stretched too long. Conversations at nearby tables quieted as people followed his stare. I felt 300 pairs of eyes turning in my direction like spotlights, illuminating every inadequacy I'd carried for 34 years. "And then," Dad said slowly, his voice carrying a weight I'd never heard before, "there's my daughter, Rachel." My heart stopped.
Maybe Aunt Carmen had been right. Maybe tonight would be different. Maybe he'd finally see what I'd been building, quietly and carefully, in those windowless government offices. Maybe he'd acknowledge that defense came in many forms, that protecting America didn't always require uniforms and ribbons and Pentagon photo ops. Rachel, Dad continued, his voice dropping to almost conversational level, which somehow made it carry further, has always been different from the rest of us. Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. Different. The word hung in the air like smoke. Shapeless, but toxic. While Daniel was earning his commission, Rachel was earning degrees. Lots of degrees. Cybersecurity, systems analysis. Very impressive on paper. He paused, his smile tight. But you know what I've learned in 40 years of building things that matter? Degrees don't win wars. Theories don't stop missiles. Good intentions don't protect soldiers. The room was completely silent now. Even the waiters had stopped moving. My daughter, Dad said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade drawn across silk, is nobody special. She's never built anything, never led anyone, never put herself on the line for something bigger than herself. She sits in government cubicles, pushing papers and running computer programs, while real Americans do the hard work of keeping this country safe. The words hit me like physical blows. Nobody special? Government cubicles? Pushing papers? 40 years of being dismissed, minimized, erased, crystallized into a single moment of public humiliation? Around me, faces stared with the horrified fascination reserved for car accidents and family meltdowns. Heat rose in my chest. Not embarrassment. Something fiercer, cleaner. Something that had been building for decades, pressed down and politely ignored and swallowed at Sunday dinners and family gatherings and company picnics where I was always introduced as Victor's other child. Dad was still talking, something about how not everyone could be a leader, how every family needed someone to handle the smaller things. But his words were fading into background noise as a lifetime of silence and acceptance and quiet endurance finally reached its breaking point. Mom was staring at her plate, her diamonds catching the light as her shoulders trembled slightly. Daniel had gone pale, his jaw tight with what might have been anger or embarrassment. Senator Brooks looked like she'd swallowed something bitter, her eyes darting between Dad and me with the calculating expression of someone watching a political career implode in real time. I set down my water glass with deliberate precision. The small sound somehow carried across the silent ballroom. Dad's voice faltered as he registered the movement, his eyes narrowing as if trying to figure out whether I was about to flee or disappear or simply melt into my chair like I had at every other family gathering for the past 3 decades. Instead, I stood up.
The simple black dress felt like armor as I rose to my full height, every eye in the room tracking my movement. My hands weren't trembling anymore. My voice, when it came, was steady as bedrock. "Perfect," I said, my words carrying clearly across the marble and crystal and shocked silence. "Then you won't mind when I tell them about the contract." The ballroom held its breath. 300 of Washington's most powerful people sat frozen in their chairs, champagne glasses halfway to their lips, conversations dying mid-sentence. Even the string quartet in the corner had stopped playing, their instruments hanging loose in suddenly nervous hands. Dad's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, irritation, then something harder as he realized I wasn't going to sit back down and disappear into the wallpaper like I always had before. "Rachel," he said, his voice carrying the warning tone I remembered from childhood. "Sit down, be quiet, don't make a scene. This isn't the time or place." "No," I said, the word cutting through his attempted dismissal like a sword through silk. "This is exactly the time and place. You want to talk about building things that matter? About putting yourself on the line for something bigger than yourself? About who's really protecting American soldiers?" I could feel my mother's mortification radiating from the head table like heat from a fire. Daniel had gone completely still. His military training probably screaming at him to defuse the situation, to restore order, to make his embarrassing sister sit down and shut up before she damaged the family name any further. But I was done protecting the family name, done protecting their comfort, done protecting their version of the truth. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, turning to address the room directly instead of my father. My voice carried clearly now, strengthened by 34 years of swallowed words finally finding their way to the surface. "My father just told you that I push papers in government cubicles, that I've never built anything that matters, that I'm nobody special." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. This wasn't how these evenings were supposed to go. Defense contractor dinners followed a script. Speeches about patriotism, toast to profit margins, polite applause for family members who knew their place. "He's right about one thing," I continued, my hands steady at my sides. "I do work for the government. I spend 14-hour days in windowless offices that most of you couldn't find on a map. I write code instead of speeches. I analyze threats instead of stock portfolios. I protect systems instead of profit margins." Dad was trying to regain control, stepping closer to his microphone. "Rachel, that's enough. The Gladiator Defense Network, Operation Cyber Shield, the Pentagon's Tier 1 Critical Infrastructure Protection Protocol." The names landed in the silence like grenades. I watched faces around the room change as people began to connect dots they hadn't even realized existed. Senator Brooks had gone very still, her sharp eyes moving between me and my father with the intensity of someone watching a chess match where the stakes were measured in billions. "Those are classified programs," Dad said, his voice tight with what might have been warning or fear. "You can't—" "I can talk about my own work," I said calmly, "especially the parts that aren't classified anymore. Like the contract your company bid on last year. The one worth $800 million to build the next generation of cyber defense systems for the U.S. military." The silence in the room had weight now, pressing down like storm clouds before lightning. I could see understanding beginning to dawn on faces throughout the ballroom. Defense executives who'd been half listening to family drama were suddenly paying very close attention. The contract Alvarez Defense Technologies lost. The one you've been telling your shareholders was stolen by lesser competitors. The one you claimed was awarded based on politics rather than capability. Dad's face had gone pale now, his knuckles white as he gripped the podium. "You don't know what you're talking about. I know exactly what I'm talking about, because I wrote the specifications for that contract. I designed the security protocols. I built the testing frameworks that your company failed to meet." The room erupted in whispers. Heads turned, phones appeared, cameras flashed. This wasn't just family drama anymore. This was news. This was the kind of story that would be front-page material in Defense Weekly and Federal Times. "For 3 years," I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word, "I worked 18-hour days building the most advanced cyber defense system in military history. Not in some corporate boardroom with mahogany tables and crystal decanters, in basement offices with fluorescent lights and coffee that tasted like motor oil. While you were playing golf with senators and drinking bourbon with generals, I was protecting the electrical grids that keep our military bases running, the communication networks that connect our troops in the field, the satellite systems that guide our missiles and our drones." Daniel was staring at me now with an expression I'd never seen before, something between shock and what might have been respect. Mom had her hand pressed to her mouth, her diamonds catching the light as she trembled. "The contract that was stolen from Alvarez Defense Technologies," I said, turning to face my father directly. "It was awarded to the team that actually understood the work, the team that had been doing the work all along, the team I led." Dad tried to speak, but no sound came out. For the first time in my life, I had rendered Victor Alvarez speechless. So you're right about one thing, Dad, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the stunned ballroom. I do push papers in government cubicles, papers that keep American soldiers alive, papers that protect our democracy from enemies you can't bomb or shoot or negotiate with. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle over the room like snow. And if that makes me nobody special, I said, then I'm proud to be nobody. The ballroom had transformed from elegant dinner party to courtroom in the space of a heartbeat. 300 faces stared at me with the kind of hungry attention usually reserved for congressional hearings and Pentagon briefings. Phone cameras glinted in the chandelier light as people scrambled to record what was clearly becoming the defense industry scandal of the year. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. But I wasn't finished. 34 years of silence had a lot of words stored up. The Gladiator Defense Network, I said, my voice carrying to every corner of the marble-columned ballroom, protects 47 critical military installations across 6 continents. It monitors 17,000 potential cyber attack vectors every second. It has prevented 12 major breaches in the past 18 months alone, breaches that could have compromised troop movements, supply chains, and classified intelligence that keeps our soldiers alive. I could see Dad struggling to process what I was saying, his face cycling through disbelief, anger, and something that might have been fear. In 40 years of building his defense empire, he'd never encountered a threat he couldn't buy, intimidate, or outmaneuver. But this wasn't a hostile takeover or a congressional investigation. This was his own daughter, armed with truths he never bothered to learn. Every morning at 0500, while you were reading profit reports over your coffee, I was in the Pentagon Situation Room briefing the Secretary of Defense on overnight threat assessments. While you were networking at country club dinners, I was working with Navy SEAL Team 6 to secure their communication protocols. While you were testifying to Congress about the need for bigger defense budgets, I was making sure the money they'd already allocated wasn't being stolen by Chinese hackers or Russian intelligence services. The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Even the waiters had stopped pretending to clear tables, standing against the walls like an audience at a theater performance. For 3 years, I said, my voice strengthening with each revelation, my team worked in Building 2E475 at the Pentagon, a basement office with no windows, no nameplate on the door, and security clearances so high that most of you couldn't even know we existed. We worked 18-hour days, 7 days a week, living on vending machine coffee and takeout Chinese food. We missed holidays, birthdays, family dinners, though in my case, nobody seemed to notice. That last line hit harder than I'd intended. I saw Mom flinch as if slapped, her hand moving instinctively to cover her mouth. Daniel was staring at me now with an expression I'd never seen before, something between guilt and awe, as if he was seeing me clearly for the first time in his life. We called ourselves the Ghost Protocol, I said, allowing myself a small smile at the memory, because officially we didn't exist. No press releases, no congressional testimony, no award ceremonies. Just results, just protection, just the quiet work of keeping America safe while everyone else took credit for winning wars we'd helped prevent. I turned to face my father directly, meeting his stunned gaze without flinching. The cyber attack on Norfolk Naval Base last March, the one that never made the news because nothing was compromised, my code stopped it. The attempted breach of the GPS satellite network in October, my algorithms caught it before it could affect a single mission. The coordinated assault on Fort Bragg's communication systems during the Syria operation, my team had it neutralized before the attackers even realized they'd been detected. That contractor, I said, savoring each word like fine wine, was Quantum Shield Technologies, a small company founded by Dr. Sarah Chen, a Stanford computer science PhD whose parents immigrated from Taiwan when she was 6 years old. A company that employs 47 of the most brilliant cyber defense specialists in the world, including 3 former NSA hackers,
2 ex-CIA cryptographers, and 1 Pentagon analyst who spent 3 years working in a basement office with no windows. The realization was beginning to dawn on faces throughout the ballroom. I could see the math being calculated behind narrowed eyes, the timeline matching up, the details clicking into place, the impossible truth becoming undeniably real. "Sarah offered me a partnership," I said, my voice steady as bedrock. "Equal ownership, equal decision-making authority, equal profits." She said I was the best cyber defense strategist she'd ever worked with, and that Quantum Shield would never have existed without the groundwork I'd laid at the Pentagon. I paused, letting the weight of that revelation settle over the room like snow. "I turned her down," I said, quietly. Not because I didn't want the partnership, but because I thought loyalty to family meant more than personal success. I thought maybe, someday, Dad would see what I'd accomplished and finally understand that his daughter wasn't a disappointment, that she wasn't nobody special. The silence stretched so long I could hear the air conditioning humming through the vents. So instead of joining Quantum Shield as a founding partner, I stayed at the Pentagon. I kept working in my windowless office. I kept missing Sunday dinners to brief generals. I kept watching my father tell everyone who would listen that his daughter was a failure who pushed papers in government cubicles. I took a step forward, closing the distance between myself and the microphone where Dad still stood frozen. But I did help Sarah prepare Quantum Shield's proposal for that $800 million contract. I made sure they understood exactly what the Pentagon needed. I helped them navigate the security clearance requirements. I vouched for their capability when the evaluation committee had questions. The crowd was beginning to understand now. Whispers were spreading from table to table like ripples across water. And when Quantum Shield won the contract, I said, meeting my father's eyes directly, it wasn't because of politics or corruption or affirmative action. It was because they were the best. Because they understood the work better than anyone else. Because they had built something that actually protected American soldiers instead of just generating profit margins for defense contractors. Dad finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "You sabotaged us," he said, his words carrying an edge of betrayal that might have cut me once. "I helped America," I said, cutting through his accusation like a sword through silk. "I made sure the most critical cyber defense contract in military history went to the people who could actually do the job, instead of the people who could afford the biggest campaign donations." The ballroom erupted in murmurs and gasps. This wasn't just about family disappointment anymore. This was about military contracts, national security, and the kind of backroom dealing that made headlines and ended political careers. But before anyone could process the full implications of what I just revealed, a clear, authoritative voice cut through the chaos from across the room. "She's absolutely right." Every head in the ballroom turned toward Table 1, where Senator Elaine Brooks was rising from her chair with the kind of deliberate authority that commanded instant attention. At 68, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd spent 30 decades navigating the shark-infested waters of Washington politics, and her gray eyes held the sharp intelligence that had made her one of the most feared interrogators on Capitol Hill. The senator's voice cut through the stunned silence like a blade through gossamer. "She's absolutely right," she said, her words carrying the weight of someone who'd seen classified briefings that most of the room couldn't even imagine. "Ms. Alvarez is not only correct about the contract award, she's being modest about her role in protecting this nation's security." Dad looked like he'd been struck by lightning. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly as Senator Brooks stepped away from her table, her evening gown rustling softly in the marble-columned silence. As chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee, I've had the privilege of reviewing Ms. Alvarez's work for the past 4 years. Not her father's work,
not her brother's service record. Her work. Her innovations in cyber defense have prevented attacks that could have crippled our military infrastructure and cost American lives. She paused, letting her words sink into the stunned crowd before delivering what felt like a surgical strike. The Gladiator Defense Network that Ms. Alvarez designed and implemented has saved the Department of Defense an estimated $4.7 billion in prevented damages and data breaches. Her early warning systems have given our military commanders strategic
advantages in 3 separate theater operations that I cannot discuss in this setting, but which have directly contributed to mission success and soldier safety. I felt something loosening in my chest, a knot of doubt and insecurity that had been tightening for 34 years. Here was validation from one of the most powerful people in Washington, delivered with the kind of authority that couldn't be dismissed or minimized or explained away. Brooks wasn't finished. "The cyber attack on our Pacific Fleet communications last spring," she said, her voice carrying the gravity of someone discussing matters of life and death, "was neutralized by Ms. Alvarez's protocols before it could compromise a single vessel or endanger a single sailor. The attempted breach of our nuclear command and control systems in November was detected and defeated by algorithms she had written 18 months earlier." The ballroom was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. Around me, defense executives and Pentagon officials were staring with expressions ranging from shock to dawning respect. These were people who measured success in billions of dollars and thousands of lives, and they were beginning to understand that the quiet woman they'd ignored all evening had been responsible for protecting both. "As for the Quantum Shield Technologies contract," Brooks continued, her tone taking on the edge that had made her famous during congressional hearings, "I was personally involved in the evaluation process. The award was based entirely on technical capability, security clearance levels, and demonstrated performance. Quantum Shield wasn't just the best bidder. They were the only bidder who fully understood the scope and complexity of what we needed." She turned to look directly at my father, her gaze carrying the kind of authority that had made grown men wilt during Senate testimony. "Mr. Alvarez," she said, her voice polite but edged with steel, "your company's proposal for that contract was inadequate. Your technical specifications were outdated, your security protocols were insufficient, and your understanding of modern cyber warfare was, frankly, 20 years behind the current threat environment." Dad's face went through several shades of red as the senator's words landed like precision-guided missiles. Around the ballroom, I could see other defense executives shifting uncomfortably in their chairs, probably wondering if their own company's proposals had been similarly critiqued in classified Pentagon meetings. What you characterized as political corruption was actually the Pentagon's recognition that cyber defense requires expertise, not just manufacturing capacity. We needed innovators, not just contractors. We needed people who understood that protecting America in the 21st century requires more than building bigger tanks and faster jets. She paused, her gaze moving across the room to encompass the entire gathering. "Ms. Alvarez represents the future of American defense," she said, her voice carrying conviction that resonated through the marble columns. "While many in this room have been focused on traditional weapons systems and conventional military thinking, she's been protecting us from enemies that most of you couldn't identify, using weapons you couldn't understand, in battles you didn't even know were being fought." The senator's words hit me like physical force. For the first time in my adult life, someone with real authority was not just acknowledging my work, but celebrating it, validating it, holding it up as an example of what American defense should become. "The young woman you've been ignoring all evening," Brooks said, her gaze finding mine across the crowded ballroom, has done more to protect American interests in the past 5 years than most defense contractors accomplish in a decade. She's prevented wars, saved lives, and secured our nation's future, all while working in basement offices with no recognition, no headlines, and apparently no respect from her own family. The silence that followed was different now, heavier, more thoughtful. These weren't just shocked gasps anymore. This was the silence of people reassessing everything they thought they knew. Daniel was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between admiration and guilt. He'd built his reputation on military service and strategic consulting, but the senator was describing achievements that dwarfed anything he'd accomplished in his decorated career. Mom had tears in her eyes, her hand pressed to her throat as if she couldn't quite breathe. I wondered if she was thinking about all the Sunday dinners where she'd dismissed my work, all the family gatherings where she'd introduced me as the daughter who did something with computers. But it was Dad's reaction that surprised me most. Instead of anger or embarrassment, his face showed something I'd never seen before: genuine confusion, as if he was trying to process information that didn't fit into any category he understood. "Senator Brooks," he said, his voice uncertain in a way I'd never heard, "that Rachel? That my daughter?" "I'm saying, Mr. Alvarez," Brooks replied with the kind of precision that had made her legendary in congressional hearings, "that your daughter is one of the most valuable national security assets this country has produced in the past decade. I'm saying that while you've been building your fortune manufacturing weapons systems, she's been preventing the wars that would have required using them." She took a step forward, her evening gown rustling in the profound silence.
"And I'm saying that calling her nobody special is not just wrong," Brooks concluded, her voice carrying a finality that felt like a judge delivering a verdict. "It's a profound disservice to someone who has served this nation with distinction, sacrifice, and a level of expertise that most of us can barely comprehend." The ballroom held its breath as the full weight of the senator's words settled over the crowd like snow. Dad stood at the podium like a statue carved from confusion and crumbling pride. His hands gripped the edges of the mahogany stand so tightly his knuckles had gone white. And for the first time in my life, Victor Alvarez looked small, diminished. The commanding presence that had filled boardrooms and intimidated Pentagon officials seemed to be leaking out of him like air from a punctured tire. That's impossible," he said, his voice barely carrying beyond the first few tables. The microphone caught his words and amplified them, but they sounded hollow, desperate. "Rachel works in... she does computers." He stopped, realizing how pathetic he sounded. Around the ballroom, 300 of Washington's most powerful people watched him struggle with truths that didn't fit into his carefully constructed worldview. Defense executives who'd sought his approval for decades were staring at him with expressions ranging from pity to professional calculation, the kind of cold assessment that preceded hostile takeovers and forced retirements. "She's never told us," Dad continued, his voice gaining a bit of strength as he grasped for familiar ground. "In 20 years of family dinners, she's never mentioned any of this. Never talked about contracts or Pentagon briefings or..." "Because she couldn't," Senator Brooks interrupted, her voice cutting through his rambling with surgical precision. "Ms. Alvarez holds security clearances that require her to discuss her work on a need-to-know basis. The projects she's described tonight are among the few that have been declassified enough to discuss publicly." She paused, letting that sink in before delivering what felt like a finishing blow. "The majority of her work," Brooks continued, "involves threats and capabilities that remain classified at levels above most people in this room, including you, Mr. Alvarez."
The implications hit Dad like a physical force. His own daughter had security clearances higher than his. Access to information he'd never see. Authority in areas where his billions of dollars and decades of influence meant nothing. "But the quantum shield contract," he said, his voice taking on the whining tone of someone who'd never learned to lose gracefully. "She admitted she helped our competitors. She sabotaged." "She ensured that American soldiers got the best protection available," I said, cutting through his self-pity with words that felt like they'd been forged in fire. "She made sure that a critical defense contract went to the most qualified bidder, not the one with the biggest lobbying budget." I stepped forward, closing the distance between us until I was standing just a few feet from the podium where he'd delivered his humiliation. "For 40 years, you've built your empire by being the lowest bidder who could meet minimum specifications. You've made billions, providing adequate equipment to soldiers who deserved the best. You've treated defense contracts like construction projects. Find the cheapest materials, hire the lowest cost labor, deliver on time and under budget." Dad's face was cycling through emotions faster than I could track. Anger, confusion, embarrassment, and something that might have been fear. "But cyber defense isn't about building things," I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. "It's about understanding things. It's about seeing connections that others miss, anticipating attacks that haven't been invented yet, protecting against enemies who adapt faster than your quarterly profit reports." I could feel the room's attention focused on me like a laser. These were people who measured success in dollars and contracts, but they were beginning to understand that I was talking about a different kind of currency entirely. When Quantum Shield submitted their proposal, they weren't just offering to build cyber defense systems. They were offering to evolve with the threat, to adapt as enemies adapted, to protect American interests in ways that static defense systems never could. Dad tried to interrupt, but I kept talking. 34 years of silence finally found its voice. "Your company's proposal was based on security protocols from 2019. You were offering to protect 2024 military systems with algorithms that couldn't have stopped a determined high school hacker. You wanted $800 million to build digital Maginot lines when our enemies were developing cyber blitzkrieg capabilities." The defense executives in the crowd were shifting uncomfortably now. I was describing problems that every major contractor faced: the tendency to fight tomorrow's wars with yesterday's weapons, to prioritize profit margins over innovation. "So yes," I said, my voice carrying to every corner of the marble-columned ballroom, "I helped Quantum Shield understand what the Pentagon really needed. I made sure they knew about threat vectors that aren't public knowledge. I vouched for their capability when the evaluation committee had questions about a small company competing against established contractors."
I paused, meeting Dad's eyes directly. "Because I care more about protecting American soldiers than protecting your stock price," I said, each word landing like a hammer blow. "Because I'd rather see the best defense win the contract than watch the cheapest bidder get Americans killed." Dad's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Around the ballroom, conversations were starting in hushed tones as people processed what they'd just heard. This wasn't just family drama anymore. This was about the fundamental purpose of defense contracting, about whether protection or profit should drive military acquisitions. 40 years, Dad finally managed, his voice sounding older than I'd ever heard it. 40 years I've been building this company, employing thousands of people, contributing to American defense. And you've been working against us? "I've been working for America," I said, my voice steady as granite. "The same America you claim to serve, but apparently only when it's profitable." The words hung in the air between us like smoke from a battlefield. For a moment, father and daughter faced each other across a chasm that had taken 34 years to fully reveal itself.
Then, Daniel stood up. My brother rose from his chair at table 3 with the deliberate precision of his military training, his dress uniform crisp under the chandelier lights. Every ribbon on his chest caught the light as he walked slowly toward the center of the ballroom, his face carrying an expression I'd never seen before. "Dad," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd commanded troops in combat, "stop." The single word fell into the silence like a stone into still water. "Rachel's right," Daniel continued, his gaze moving between our father and me. "She's always been right. We just never bothered to listen." Daniel's words cut through the ballroom's tension like a blade through silk. My brother stood in the center of the marble-columned space, his dress uniform pristine under the chandelier lights, every ribbon and medal catching the golden glow. But there was something different in his posture now, a weight that hadn't been there during his earlier moment of glory. "For 20 years," Daniel said, his voice carrying the steady authority of someone who'd commanded troops in combat, "I've watched this family celebrate the wrong things." Dad stared at him with an expression of complete bewilderment. In his world, military service and corporate success were the only measures of worth that mattered. The idea that his golden son might disagree was clearly beyond his comprehension. "We celebrate contracts signed," Daniel continued, his gaze sweeping across the stunned crowd. "We celebrate stock prices rising, we celebrate weapons sold and buildings constructed and profit margins maintained. We throw dinner parties to honor 40 years of business success." He turned to look directly at me, and for the first time in our lives, I saw something in my brother's eyes that looked like respect. "But we've never celebrated the wars that didn't happen," he said, his words carrying clearly to every corner of the ballroom. "We've never honored the attacks that were prevented. We've never acknowledged the lives that were saved by someone working in a basement office with no nameplate on the door." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. These were people who understood military service, who knew the weight of life and death decisions. Daniel was speaking their language now, translating my work into terms they could comprehend. "My sister," Daniel said, his voice growing stronger with each word, "has prevented more casualties than every medal on my chest represents. She's won more victories for American security than I accomplished in 4 tours of duty. She's served her country with a dedication that makes my military service look like weekend reserve training." Dad opened his mouth as if to object, but Daniel held up a hand with the kind of authority that had been forged under fire.
"And we've treated her like an embarrassment," he said, his words landing with the force of artillery rounds. "Like a disappointment, like someone who couldn't find her place in the real world." He turned to address the entire ballroom now, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who'd finally understood a truth that had been hidden in plain sight. "Ladies and gentlemen," Daniel said, "I want to tell you about real legacy, real service, real sacrifice." I felt tears threatening behind my eyes as my brother, the golden child who'd never had to fight for recognition, began to tell my story better than I'd ever been able to tell it myself. "While I was earning commendations and combat ribbons," he said, "Rachel was missing holidays to brief the Joint Chiefs of Staff. While I was giving interviews to Military Times, she was working 18-hour days to protect infrastructure that keeps our democracy functioning. While I was building my reputation as a strategic consultant, she was actually preventing the conflicts that would have required consulting." The crowd was leaning forward now, hanging on his every word. This wasn't just testimony anymore, it was revelation. The attacks that never made headlines? The breaches that never happened? The wars that never started because our enemies couldn't penetrate our defenses? Those aren't accidents. Those aren't luck. Those are the result of people like my sister working in secret, sacrificing recognition for results. He turned back to face our father, his voice taking on an edge I'd never heard before. "Dad, you built a company that makes weapons for wars. Rachel built systems that prevent wars from happening. You've spent 40 years profiting from conflict. She spent her career making conflict impossible." The words hit Dad like physical blows. I could see him struggling to process a worldview that turned everything he'd believed about success and service upside down. "But here's what really makes me ashamed," he said, his voice growing quieter but somehow more powerful. "It's not just that we failed to recognize Rachel's achievements, it's that we actively diminished them. We made her feel small for doing work that was actually enormous. We made her apologize for being extraordinary." I felt something breaking open in my chest. Not painful, but cleansing, like floodwaters finally finding their way to the sea. Every Sunday dinner where we ignored her career, every family gathering where we dismissed her contributions, every time we introduced her as the daughter who does something with computers, we weren't just being thoughtless, we were being willfully blind to the most important work anyone in this family has ever done. The silence that followed was profound. 300 of Washington's most powerful people sat motionless, absorbing the weight of what they'd just heard. Then Daniel did something I'd never expected. He walked over to where I stood, stopped directly in front of me, and offered a military salute, crisp, formal, and filled with genuine respect. "Thank you for your service," he said, his voice carrying the solemnity of a medal ceremony. "Thank you for protecting us. Thank you for sacrificing recognition to keep America safe." The salute held for a long moment, and then something remarkable happened. Senator Brooks stood and began to applaud. Then the retired admiral at table 5. Then the Pentagon officials scattered throughout the crowd. Within seconds, 300 people were on their feet, their applause thundering through the marble columns like a victory celebration. But I wasn't looking at the crowd. I was looking at my father, still frozen at his podium, his face cycling through emotions I couldn't read. Anger, confusion, loss, and maybe, just maybe, the beginning of something that looked like understanding. "This is what legacy really means," I said, my voice somehow carrying clearly through the applause. "It's not about buildings with your name on them or stock prices in the Wall Street Journal. It's about work that matters, service that protects, sacrifice that saves lives." I gestured toward the applauding crowd. I said, "These people understand that. They know the difference between making weapons and preventing wars, between profit and purpose, between building an empire and building a future." The applause was beginning to die down, but people remained standing, their faces showing a respect I'd never experienced before. "I don't need my name on buildings. I don't need magazine covers or congressional testimony or dinner parties in my honor. I need to know that American soldiers are coming home alive because the systems I built kept them safe. I need to know that families are sleeping peacefully because attacks I prevented never happened." I looked directly at my father, meeting his confused gaze without flinching. "That's the legacy I'm proud of," I said. "And if you can't understand that, then maybe the problem isn't that I'm nobody special. Maybe the problem is that you've forgotten what special actually means." The applause faded like distant thunder, leaving behind a silence that felt different than before, heavier with understanding, charged with possibility. 300 people remained standing, their faces showing expressions ranging from respect to awe to the kind of calculation that preceded major career decisions. I could see defense executives exchanging glances, Pentagon officials typing notes into their phones, senators reassessing everything they thought they knew about the quiet Alvarez daughter. But I wasn't looking at them anymore. I was looking at my family. Mom sat at the head table with tears streaming down her cheeks, her perfectly applied makeup ruined by emotions she'd clearly never expected to feel. Her diamonds caught the chandelier light as her shoulders trembled, and I wondered if she was thinking about all the Sunday dinners where she'd asked about my little computer hobby with polite disinterest. Daniel remained at attention, his salute finally lowered, but his posture still carrying the respect of a soldier honoring a fallen comrade. His face showed something I'd never seen before. Not just admiration, but a kind of grief, as if he was mourning all the years he'd spent blind to his sister's sacrifices. And Dad. Dad stood at his podium like a statue carved from bewilderment and crumbling authority, his hands still gripping the mahogany edges as if they were the only things keeping him upright. For 40 years, he'd commanded rooms with his presence, shaped narratives with his voice, built his identity around being the smartest person in any gathering. Now he looked lost, diminished, struggling to process a reality that didn't fit into any category he understood. "Rachel," he said, his voice barely audible through the microphone. I never knew." "You never asked," I said quietly, but my words carried clearly in the profound silence. "For 34 years, you never once asked what I actually did, never wondered why I worked late nights or missed family gatherings, never cared enough to find out why the Pentagon kept giving me security clearances or why senators returned my phone calls." I took a step back from the podium, creating distance that felt both physical and metaphorical. "You assumed that because my work wasn't visible, it wasn't valuable. Because I didn't build things you could touch or count, I wasn't building anything that mattered. Because I chose service over profit, I must not understand what success looked like." The words weren't angry anymore. They were simply true, delivered with the calm finality of someone who'd finally stopped trying to convince others of her worth. But tonight showed me something important. My work speaks for itself. My achievements don't need your validation. My legacy doesn't require your approval. I turned toward the exit, then paused, looking back at my family one final time. "Mom," I said, my voice softening slightly, "I love you. I always will. But I won't sit at any more Sunday dinners where my career is treated like a hobby. I won't attend any more family gatherings where I'm introduced as the daughter who couldn't find her place in the real world." She started to speak, but I held up a gentle hand. "Daniel," I continued, meeting my brother's eyes, "thank you for what you said tonight. It means more than you know. But respect given in a crisis doesn't erase 34 years of dismissal. I hope you understand that." He nodded slowly, his face showing the kind of pain that came from recognizing irreversible mistakes. "And Dad," I said, looking directly at the man who'd raised me, supported me financially, and never once seen me clearly, "I hope someday you figure out the difference between building an empire and building a legacy, between making money and making a difference, between being successful and being significant." I walked toward the exit, my black dress rustling softly in the marble silence. Behind me, I could hear whispered conversations beginning, phones buzzing with messages, the machinery of Washington gossip beginning to process what would undoubtedly become the defense industry story of the year. "Rachel, wait!" Mom's voice cut through the murmurs, desperate and pleading. "Please don't. We can fix this. We can have dinner next week. Just us, as a family. We can—" "No, Mom," I said, turning back one final time. "You can't fix 34 years of not seeing me with one dinner. You can't repair decades of dismissal with a single conversation. Some things, once broken, don't go back together the same way." I could see the pain in her eyes, the genuine regret that was probably the first honest emotion she'd shown all evening. But regret wasn't the same as change, and change wasn't the same as understanding. "I'm not angry," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the ballroom. "I'm not bitter. I'm not trying to punish anyone or prove any points. I'm simply done pretending that being invisible in my own family is acceptable because it's comfortable for everyone else." I walked toward the exit with steady steps, my spine straight, my head high. Behind me, the most powerful people in Washington were probably already composing text messages, scheduling phone calls, recalculating their assessment of Rachel Alvarez. By tomorrow morning, my name would be circulating in Pentagon meetings and defense contractor boardrooms. Job offers would arrive, speaking invitations would follow. Recognition would come flooding in from sources I'd never expected.
But as I pushed through the ballroom's ornate doors and stepped into the hotel lobby, what I felt wasn't triumph or vindication. It was something simpler and more profound: freedom. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't have to pretend that my family's opinion of me mattered more than my own. I didn't have to smile politely while being diminished. I didn't have to choose between honoring my parents and honoring myself. The Washington night air was cool against my face as I walked toward the hotel entrance. Behind me, the glittering ballroom continued its stunned processing of what had just occurred. Ahead of me, the city lights stretched toward a horizon filled with possibilities I'd never allowed myself to imagine. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a number I'd never called but had always kept. Dr. Sarah Chen,
founder of Quantum Shield Technologies, the woman who'd offered me a partnership I'd turned down out of misplaced family loyalty. The phone rang twice before her familiar voice answered. "Sarah," I said, stepping into the cool night air outside the Mayflower Hotel. "It's Rachel Alvarez. Are you still looking for a partner?" 6 weeks after the dinner that changed everything, I stood in my new office on the 42nd floor of a glass tower in downtown D.C., watching the Potomac River flow like liquid silver in the morning light. The nameplate on my door read, Dr. Rachel Alvarez, co-founder and chief technical officer, Quantum Shield Technologies. Below it, in smaller letters, Cyber Defense Division. The office was nothing like the windowless Pentagon basement where I'd spent so many years. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the Capitol, where senators and generals and defense contractors moved through their daily routines, many of them probably still talking about the confrontation that had become Washington's most discussed dinner party scandal of the decade. My phone buzzed constantly with interview requests, speaking invitations, and job offers from companies whose names I'd only seen on classified contractor lists. Defense Weekly wanted a cover story. The Washington Post had called 3 times. CNN was asking about a documentary. Apparently, the woman who'd been invisible for 34 years had become very visible indeed. But what surprised me most wasn't the external recognition, it was how little I needed it. Sarah Chen walked on my office door, her arms full of contract folders and her face showing the kind of satisfied exhaustion that came from building something important. At 38, she carried herself with the confident energy of someone who'd turned brilliant ideas into billion-dollar realities. But she'd never lost the scientist's curiosity that had made her one of the most innovative cyber defense minds of her generation. The Pentagon wants to expand the Gladiator network to cover naval installations in the Pacific. They're talking about a 3-year contract worth $2.4 billion, she said, settling into one of the chairs across from my desk. I nodded, scanning the preliminary specifications she handed me. It was exactly the kind of work I'd been doing for years, protecting American interests from enemies who fought in digital shadows. The difference was that now my name would be on the contracts. My expertise would be acknowledged. My innovations would be credited to the person who'd actually created them. "There's something else," Sarah said, her voice taking on a note of careful neutrality. "Victor Alvarez called. He wants to meet with you." I looked up from the contracts, surprised. In the 6 weeks since the dinner, I'd heard nothing directly from my father. Daniel had reached out twice, respectful messages acknowledging what he called the family's failure to see you clearly. Mom had sent flowers with a note that simply said, "I'm sorry." But Dad had remained silent, his pride apparently too wounded for direct contact. He says Alvarez Defense Technologies wants to discuss a partnership, joint ventures in cyber defense, shared expertise. He mentioned something about combining our family's strengths for America's benefit. I laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Even now, even after everything, Dad was trying to turn my success into his advantage. Instead of acknowledging his failure to see me, he was attempting to co-opt my achievements. "What did you tell him?" I asked. "That all partnership discussions would need to go through you, that Quantum Shield doesn't do business based on family connections, that if Alvarez Defense Technologies wants to work with us, they'll need to prove they can meet our standards." Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the Capitol dome gleaming in the morning sun. Somewhere in those hallways, senators were probably discussing defense appropriations that would fund projects I'd designed. In Pentagon briefing rooms, generals were analyzing threat assessments based on algorithms I'd written. In military installations around the world, soldiers were sleeping safely behind cyber defenses I'd created. My phone buzzed with another message. This one was from Daniel. "Saw the Defense Weekly article about your new contract. Proud of you. Dad's struggling, but maybe that's not your problem to solve anymore." He was right. For 34 years, I'd tried to earn recognition by being what my family wanted me to be. I stayed quiet when I should have spoken up, accepted dismissal when I deserved respect, chose loyalty over self-worth because I thought love meant making myself smaller to make others comfortable.
But the dinner at the Mayflower had taught me something profound.
I had never been the problem. My achievements had never been inadequate. My career had never been insignificant. The only thing that had been wrong was my willingness to accept other people's limited vision of who I was. "Schedule a meeting with him," I told Sarah, my voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd finally learned her own worth. Not as his daughter, as the co-founder of a company he wants to partner with. If Alvarez Defense Technologies can bring value to Quantum Shield's mission, we'll consider it. If they're just looking for reflected credibility, they can look elsewhere. Sarah nodded with the kind of smile that suggested she'd hoped for exactly that response. Another knock interrupted our conversation. My assistant appeared in the doorway with a visitor who made my breath catch in my throat. Senator Elaine Brooks stood in my office entrance, her silver hair catching the morning light, her presence filling the space with the kind of authority that came from 3 decades of wielding real power in Washington. "Dr. Alvarez," she said, extending her hand with a smile that seemed genuinely warm. "I hope you don't mind the unscheduled visit. I was in the building for another meeting, and I wanted to personally congratulate you on the Quantum Shield expansion." We shook hands, and I gestured for her to take a seat. Sarah excused herself with a professional smile, leaving me alone with one of the most powerful people in Washington. "That was quite a speech you gave 6 weeks ago," Brooks said, settling into her chair with the comfortable confidence of someone accustomed to important conversations. "I've been in politics for 30 years, and I've never seen anyone turn a family dinner into a national security seminar quite so effectively." "I didn't plan it that way," I admitted. "I just got tired of being invisible." "Invisible," Brooks repeated, shaking her head. "Do you know how many classified briefings I've received that were based on your work? How many times have I had to defend budget allocations for projects you designed? You've been protecting this country for years, Dr. Alvarez. The only people who couldn't see that were your own family." She leaned forward slightly, her gray eyes sharp with intelligence. "Which brings me to why I'm here. The Senate Armed Services Committee is looking for a new director of cyber defense policy, someone who understands both the technical challenges and the strategic implications, someone who can translate complex threat assessments into actionable policy recommendations." I felt my pulse quicken. The position she was describing would put me at the center of American cyber defense strategy, with authority to shape how the nation protected itself in an increasingly digital world. The job comes with challenges: congressional testimony, classified briefings, coordinating with allies, managing relationships with defense contractors who may not appreciate your direct communication style. She paused, her expression suggesting she was remembering my father's public humiliation. But it also comes with the opportunity to build cyber defense policy from the ground up, to ensure that America's digital infrastructure is protected by someone who actually understands the threats we face. I looked out at the Capitol dome gleaming in the distance, thinking about all the years I'd worked in basement offices, protecting systems that kept democracy functioning while remaining invisible to the people I served. "Senator," I said, meeting her gaze directly, "I spent 34 years being told I was nobody special. I'm not interested in being anyone's token appointment or diversity hire. If you're offering me this position, it needs to be because I'm the best person for the job." Brooks smiled, and for the first time, her expression showed something approaching genuine affection. "Dr. Alvarez, after 6 weeks of reviewing your classified work history, consulting with Pentagon officials, and watching video of your impromptu defense policy lecture at the Mayflower Hotel, I can say with absolute certainty that you're not just the best person for this job, you're the only person for this job." She stood, extending her hand again. "Think about it. Take your time, but know that your country needs you in a role where your expertise can shape policy, not just implement it." After she left, I sat alone in my office, watching the city move through its daily rhythms below. 6 weeks ago, I'd been the invisible daughter at a family dinner dismissed as nobody special by the man who'd raised me.
Now I was being offered the opportunity to shape American cyber defense policy at the highest levels of government. The transformation felt surreal, but also inevitable. I hadn't become someone new. I'd simply stopped hiding who I'd always been. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Dr. Alvarez, this is Margaret Alvarez. Could we meet for coffee? Just the two of us. I have some things I need to say. Mom."
I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "Tomorrow, 10 a.m., Cafe Luna on K Street. But we meet as two adults, not as mother and daughter trying to repair something that was never properly built in the first place." The response came quickly. "Understood. Thank you for giving me a chance." I set the phone down and returned to reviewing the Gladiator Network expansion contracts. Outside my window, the Potomac flowed steadily toward the sea, carrying with it the remnants of yesterday while preparing the path for tomorrow. For the first time in my life, I knew exactly who I was and what I was worth. The daughter who'd spent 34 years being nobody special had finally learned the most important truth of all. She had always been enough. 1 year later, I stood in the Senate Armed Services Committee hearing room, delivering my quarterly cyber defense briefing to the most powerful people in the American government. The nameplate in front of me read, "Dr. Rachel Alvarez, Director of Cyber Defense Policy." Behind me, classified slides showed threat assessments, prevention statistics, and strategic recommendations that would shape how America protected itself in an increasingly digital world. In the gallery, Sarah Chen sat with our Quantum Shield team, their faces showing the quiet pride of people building something that mattered. My phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. "Watching on C-SPAN, Dad's watching too, he's learning." I smiled, thinking about the coffee meeting with Mom 6 months ago. Awkward, but honest. The beginning of a relationship built on mutual respect rather than forced family obligation. About Dad's stilted but genuine apology delivered through Daniel. About Sunday dinners I no longer attended, choosing instead to build my own traditions with people who saw me clearly. Senator Brooks called for questions, and I straightened in my chair, ready to defend budgets and explain strategies and translate complex threats into policy language. This was my legacy now. Not the daughter who'd been dismissed, but the leader who would emerge when she finally stopped accepting other people's limitations. In my briefcase sat a small photo, my Quantum Shield team celebrating our latest contract success. No family names, no inherited authority, just brilliant people doing work that kept America safe. I was never nobody special. I was always enough.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.